Okay, so let's go on with the first panelist is Jason Annabelle. He's the National Co-Chair for Construction with Macmillan LLP. Next in line is Geza Banfi. He's just known as counsel to Macmillan LLP. So he is always the cloak and dagger one. We've got Stephen Gava. He is client executive with Marsh Canada. And we have, last but not least, Gary Rodriguez, who's the Senior Vice President and Senior Client Engagement for Marsh. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for giving of your time and of your expertise. And I'm going to give the participants in this webinar a little bit of background as to what we're trying to do here. We're not just a webinar series. We're not just trying to be on the air. What we're trying to do is tap into the vast expertise from our Associate Partner Program, our APP program, and draw on their experiences and their knowledge to assist contractors making decisions, giving them the information, the timely information that they need to make decisions. The precursor for all of this is, and I'm going to ask a basic question, and I'm going to answer it myself in order to give you guys an idea of what's going on. The question is, what is the difference between knowledge and wisdom? The answer is, knowledge is learning from your own mistakes. If you're walking along the street, you trip, you fall, you scrape your knee, that was your mistake, you learned from it. Wisdom is learning from someone else's mistake. So you have the vantage point of seeing that individual fall and trip their knee, and then therefore you understand that there's a hazard there. By employing wisdom, you can alleviate that hazard and get around it. What I want to implore upon our participants here is that tap into the knowledge base, the wisdom that you have in both your legal counsels and your surety providers. They will help you through a lot of problems at the onset. Don't wait until it becomes a problem. Tap into them when you first have the contract or you're having that difficult conversation about a project. Initially, they will guide you through it. They're here to help you. And I hope you understand that their wisdom is worth more than the dollars and cents that you would spend initially to avoid a problem. Remember, it's worth $1 at the beginning as opposed to 100 at the end. So with that said, what I'd like to do is, I guess, just jump into this. We're going to have a number of questions for the panelists, and then the panelists are going to answer. What I'd like to do right off the bat is I'm going to go to Geza as the most learned of our panelists. And I'd like to pose a simple question to you, Geza, which is, what are you hoping that contractors come away with today's presentation?
Well, I'm hoping that contractors come away with this with a sense of hope. I'm hoping for hope. Thank you, Giovanni. If I'm the most learned by your knowledge versus wisdom point, what that means to me is that of everybody on this panel, I've made the most mistakes so far. So, and I accept that. I'm only going to spend a couple of minutes at the outset because we want to give maximum airtime to Jason and Gary and Steve, who are really imparting the hardcore information that will set up the what we hope will be a productive Q&A with everyone. The point of this webinar, I'll get right to the point. COVID-19, to state the obvious, has stressed the industry. We can be grateful that we're not in the restaurant business or in the airline business, but still, there's no question that COVID-19 has challenged construction people right across the spectrum and across the pyramid, from owners through to GCs to trades and suppliers. The problem with a stressor like this, of course, is that it exposes flaws in that are otherwise hidden in the good times. And what I'm talking about are things like poor contracts with bad risk allocations, loose construction management practices, cavalier attitudes and approaches to the assumption of risk and then the management of risk. And a stressor like this, like a falling tide exposing rocks and shoals, exposes these kinds of problems. And with some firms, it pushes them towards the margin of viability. And the message in this webinar from this collective group is it doesn't have to be like this. There are lots of things you can do. The focus today is on really three broad areas. The contract, we'll start with Jason right after I finish. Risk management, the management of risk generally, and Gary has a great presentation on that. And then working with your surety partner, and that's Steve's bailiwick. The surety is your partner, and you can work with them in times like this, and it's important to do that. So the outcome today is hope, and a sense that there are things to do to avoid being pushed towards the margins if you are a company. And so thank you for coming, and we hope that you get a lot out of this. With that, I'll hand it over to my colleague Jason Annabelle, who will deal with the contractual aspects of this problem. Jason?
Indeed. Giovanni, did you want to set up with a question, or shall I just move into my analysis?
No, I think it's important for our contractors and participants to understand the basis of where we're coming from. I presented to the Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs, and they then report to the government on what should be done, and they take each individual's organization, or in our case, our sector, into consideration when they're moving forward. We gave some recommendations, and one of those recommendations was in essence about managing risk around force majeure. And I think it's important for our contractors to understand fully why is it that they want to manage that risk. So Jason, if you could just lead us down the path, if you will.
Yeah, I will do that. Force majeure is definitely the place to start our consideration of the contract, given what has transpired with COVID-19. And I want to pick up on Geza's message of hope before I move into the analysis, and identify that I hope that you will feel that. And you know, my objective is also to impart, as I know Stephen's and Gary's is to impart a sense of empowerment. So that is my hope for what I'm about to tell you. So what is force majeure anyway? It's an unforeseeable intervening event outside the control of either party to the contract, and it's capable of delaying the performance of the work. Sound familiar? I mean, COVID-19 is a textbook example of a force majeure event. There are clauses in many contracts that deal with force majeure, and a typical one will enumerate a number of force majeure items and then have a basket clause to capture other items that aren't enumerated. And by virtue of that basket clause, COVID-19 has been caught by many contracts. Some of the events that are listed are strikes, war, lightning, acts of God. Those are the things that you typically see within a clause. And when such an event happens, the purpose of the clause is to manage and allocate risk. And typically that means your contractor will receive some sort of scheduling relief when a force majeure event happens. A huge problem that faced our construction industry is that so many contractors did not have such a clause in their contracts. And that leads to an extraordinary assumption of risk on the part of the contractor. They assume the risk for the schedule and performance when such events happen. And so for reasons that are beyond the contractor's control, they can become liable for liquidated damages, owner losses, and even termination of contract in the absence of having an appropriately worded force majeure clause. So that's the first comment that I want to impart to our attendees. The next is monetary compensation for delay. we started, and there are different kinds of delay, and we'll talk about those in a second, Giovanni. But we started talking about force majeure, and typically, when you have a force majeure event, contracts afford your contractor additional time, but not money. And that has been seen as a sharing of the risk of this event that is neither the fault of the owner or the contractor. And up until COVID-19, that is seen to be a pretty equitable way to go. There are some contracts that, of course, are different, where the contractor is entitled to costs and time, but typically it is just time. The reason why we've been forced to reconsider the wisdom of this sharing of risk is because COVID-19, which fits the description of a force majeure event, is expensive to the contractor. It can dramatically increase the cost of performing the contract. Loss of productivity because of social distancing, purchasing PPE equipment, disruptions in the supply chain, workers who don't want to come to work because they're afraid of what may unfold. These are all risks that the contractor typically assumes in a relationship. Now, good news for some, because even contracts that don't provide for additional costs in the event of a force majeure event, many of them will provide for additional costs where there is a change in law. And so if you're looking at your CCDC form contracts, we're looking at section 10.2.7 within that contract, where after you've bid, if there's a change in law, your contractor is entitled to submit a change order for additional costs that they take on as a result of the change in law. And so with COVID-19, we're dealing with changes in guidelines to ensure safety on site. And that's an area where your contractor could piggyback and say, okay, well, I just get an extension of time because of the force majeure delay event, but there's these changes in law that I'm entitled to additional cost for. And so Geza and I work together. We have seen many contractors obtain relief through that escape valve. That escape valve has a limited time though, because now that COVID-19 has happened, going forward, query whether there'll be any further change in law. The change in law has happened. So I would flag that again for our attendees. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the different kinds of delay. And I mentioned that I would touch on this. One of them is owner caused, right? So if your owner prohibits your contractor to access the site in some way or causes some episode of delay, typically your contractor is going to get both time and money. There are government shutdown orders, right? And with a government shutdown order, typically your contractor, again, will get time and money. There's force majeure, which we've talked a little bit about, where you usually get time, but not money. And then there's contractor delay, where you don't get anything. And in fact, you might be in trouble. You might be on the hook for liquidated damages or those sorts of things if your contractor or you, the contractor, have caused delay. Now, why do I raise this point? I raise this point because depending on what delay has happened can lead to different suspension and termination rights. And you want to be thinking about that, particularly given the lessons from COVID-19. The other reason why I raise it is because what does COVID-19 fall under? I've dealt with many cases, Geza has dealt with many cases where you could characterize COVID-19 as falling under a government shutdown, because there was one, a force majeure event, because in looking at the definition, clearly it is one, and owner caused delay, because we've had the good fortune of representing many owner side clients. We represent everybody in the construction pyramid, and some of them are owners. Many good owners who shut the site down because they were afraid for the safety of their contractors and their workers. And so you're dealing with a circumstance where COVID-19 could fit numerous categories with different rights flowing as a result. So that's a weakness within contracts that has been exploited through COVID-19. The other point I would make to our contractor audience is notices of delay. So when some sort of event happens under your contract, often there are provisions that require your contractor to put their hand up and say to the owner, we're suffering a delay event. And as a result of this, we're going to require the following compensation. And there are timelines that are prescribed within contracts, and adhering to those timelines, particularly in Ontario, jurisdictions differ on their approach to these things, but particularly in Ontario, you really do need to be mindful of your notices, or you could prejudice your ability to recover for delay events that you suffer. And the other thing you need to be mindful of is the substance of the notices. There might be contractual requirements to have certain information within your notice so that your owner understands what you're claiming. There's been quite a game that's unfolded through COVID-19 where, sometimes there are pre-delay notices that I've drafted many of them. I've responded to many pre-delay notices where your contractor puts up its hand saying, we're suffering delay. We don't really know exactly how we've been impacted, but we know we've been impacted. And so then this continuing series of notices are delivered to update your owner in due course as new information comes in to understand the impact of COVID-19. I raise this because seeing an event like COVID-19 shows you the challenges that there are in delay notices, and you want to make sure that your contract provides a reasonable period of time for you to provide a delay notice, and also for you to support that delay notice over time. You can't tell the owner what all the impacts are going to be if you don't know. So you need some sort of contractual valve to allow yourself time to provide perhaps an initial notice and then subsequent notices as information becomes available. And so with the comments that I've provided, it might become obvious perhaps that in this world, parties might want to consider an actual COVID-19 clause that deals with these matters specifically for COVID-19. So notice, suspension, termination, mitigation, calculation of losses, all of those things within a specific clause designed to deal with COVID-19 is increasingly a smart consideration. And then, of course, you have your traditional considerations, and with this I'll conclude, and that is your schedule. Your schedule is more important than ever. So there are conferences that I know Geza and I both speak at in terms of delay. Delay has always been an issue in construction and never more important than it is now. So the importance of the schedule, I think Gary has comments on it, will become apparent. And then high levels of communication. One thing that I've seen that very positive, communications between owner and contractor, high levels of collaboration all the way through COVID-19. I've certainly seen the opposite. But generally within my practice, I have seen high levels of collaboration and communication to try and get the job done and make sure that workers on site are safe. So certainly a positive. We may see a bit of a retraction of that behavior as parties move to protect their rights and seek as much cost as they can, but cause for hope. And my hope is our group feels empowered by that, and I'll be interested to hear my panelists' comments along with further questions from the group.
So we have received a question, but I'm going to hold off on the questions if you guys don't mind. Not that I don't want to dive deeply into the force majeure language, but I'd like to switch gears a little bit. In my multiple presentations that I did to SCAFIA, my second one was specific to small and medium-sized businesses. And I really want to highlight the fact that unlike larger firms, they may not have inside legal counsel or they might not have the wherewithal to deal with this simply because they've it's overwhelmed them. I could say that COVID is one of these things that is a global phenomenon, and it has been felt by our contractors. It's not to say that construction companies don't deal with challenges every day, but I'd like to change gears and talk to Gary specifically on the impacts of COVID to the industry, especially to the smaller and medium-sized contractors. What would you, advice-wise, how would you help them along the way? Guidance, anything that could be helpful here, Gary, would be welcomed. So I'll give you the floor now.
All right, thank you, Giovanni, and thank you everybody for allowing me to participate in this great forum today in the inaugural event for OGCA. I'm thrilled to be here. I think in the position that I have inside Marsh Advisory, where my responsibilities cover both Canada and the United States, I think that I have the luxury of working with large, medium, and small companies of all kinds, general contractors of all kinds. So having that opportunity, which is unique, I mean, Marsh being a big brokerage firm obviously has a lot of big clients. big GCs, and we also have a tremendous number, and increasingly, medium and small size companies. And being able to take a look at what some of the larger best practices leaders are doing, and for that matter, many smaller and medium sized best practices leaders are doing. I take a look at the impact of COVID kind of in a little bit differently, and I think it's important to state that whether you're small, medium, or large, is the best contractors bet on themselves to control their own destiny, right? So we can't be paralyzed by the fear, or we can't be paralyzed by the tumult, because there's always going to be somebody that's kind of trying to get around us, or try to move ahead, or try to get the upper hand or the competitive advantage. And now, so we have an industry, and we have small and medium-sized companies as well as large ones that are stressed differently. COVID brings on, and I think Gaze's comment about these stressors is particularly powerful. COVID is just another stress. To me, I think we've already been stressed by volatile legal climate. We are already stressed and always will be by the prospect of severe weather. We've already got a changing risk set of exposures because the industry in itself is evolving. We now have technology coming in play, and we move from 2D and 3D BIM systems, and there's discussions about 5D. And you know, you take a look at the Stephen will talk about a little bit in the context of surety. You take a look at contractual risk transfer and letters of credit, and how these markets are tightening. And you already have a shortage of workers, an aging workforce that's not being replenished. To some extent, robotics and artificial intelligence is beginning to come into play in some ways. But all of those things were already happening before COVID. So now comes along COVID. We're already dealing with some very significant stressors. And then I think, to answer your question, Giovanni, is a small and medium-sized company should put themselves on a path toward taking a look at where is that? What is our destiny? And how strongly do we want to control it? And can we try to not be paralyzed? Because in that paralysis, as I mentioned, you lose competitive advantage. But we're also being stressed in ways that differently, liquidity-wise. I mean, everybody is now beginning to suffer with, you know, many small and medium-sized companies struggle liquidity-wise. On a good day, now you have COVID coming in and impacting in some great ways the pressure on the balance sheet. And so, you know, my suggestion with COVID is to not look at it like it's suddenly there's this big boulder in the middle of the road, or a fork in the middle of the road, and we have to make new decisions. We just have to begin to manage its impacts in ways that we're already managing the stressors, those other stressors that I mentioned. We've got one more. It's increased safety. It's more focus on the schedule, as Jason mentioned. Pay close attention to contractual contracts that you have. Owners are beginning to try to push, and we're seeing it already, push more of it down onto the GCs, and then of course that puts you into a position, what do we do in terms of pushing it down onto subcontractors and the like. So it's to me, I don't see COVID necessarily as a break the bank stressor. I see it as another major stressor that needs to be managed in similar fashion to all those other things that I mentioned that are happening in today's environment. I like to think, and I go back, I started my career about 40 years or so ago in the nuclear Navy, and after that I went to work for a large engineering construction firm that built nuclear power plants. I go back 40 years and I think back of how unique that industry already was in dealing with some of the unique health and safety requirements to come with exposures to things that we can't see, smell, or taste, right? Similar to this COVID virus. And, you know, the nuclear industry, what did they do? They enhanced their personal protective equipment protocols. They always used good equipment, and they trained their people well. and they trained them to perform in that difficult environment. Now you fast forward 40 years to today, the nuclear industry, because of those unknowns and the fears and the I can't see it, taste it, smell it, the more use of personal protective equipment and stuff, there's lessons learned that we can take away from those experiences. And I think that we're seeing that, particularly with the enhanced, or what I now call strategic safety needs, right? We've always dealt with safety to comply. We've dealt with safety because we want our workers to stay healthy and safe. We want to maintain as few lost time injuries as we possibly can. That has an impact on our insurance. And, you know, you see and you experience the direction that all that goes. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I think it's time for the best of the general contractors, small, medium, and large, to adopt more of a best practices mindset. And with that in mind, we developed early on when the pandemic first began to hit, and as I think all of you have experienced, you know, it hit us fast. We didn't know what to do. Everybody was stunned. New regulations were quickly put in place for workplace safety, and the population density on job sites, restrictions on job sites, changes in porta potties, and the distancing between wash stations, all very, very impact, and every one of them having an impact, obviously, on additional costs. And that takes it into that discussion that Jason just had of keep track, follow those costs, put them in the right buckets, try to anticipate how you might want to get paid, or looking and studying your contracts with your attorneys, looking at force majeure and things like that, and how are we going to deal with it. And then, of course, also the other kind of contract is an insurance contract, and whether or not we have any relevant insurance that might respond to those additional costs is a tool to help everybody, general contractors and contractors of all size. We kind of came out with a methodology that we call SUSTAIN, a 7-step, if you will, process by which, if you just remember it, you know, spell out SUSTAIN, and you think of the first S in SUSTAIN is really focus on safety and security. We want to maintain during this pandemic, and as we come out of it, safety, performance, and liquidity. Right? So safety and security are right up there in the the frontal lobe of my brain for project shutdowns, protect your people, site and physical assets for the duration. Your insurance is going to require that if a job site has been shut down, that you do protect your equipment. For ongoing projects, which we see most of projects are either restarted or are ongoing, just continuing to develop your workplace safety plans and enhance them is necessary. Think of safety more strategically as opposed to tactically. Jason mentioned, and I think this is very, very important, about schedules. I and my team, our specialty inside Marsh Advisory is this, taking a deep dive in or a magnification of different points on the schedule. Continuously update and refine your schedule and do it as quick as possible. Keep copies of your schedules in the event that there are any disputes or insurance issues that go back. So you've got SUSTAIN, you've got S, safety and security. U, update your schedules. The second S in SUSTAIN is study your contracts. And I'm not going to get into a deep dive discussion on contracts because Jason just did a great job in talking about all of those issues. But, you know, understand with the help of your attorneys. And if I could give you one takeaway piece of advice, really work with your attorneys and your brokers to study your contracts and know what you have in terms of your obligations, protections, and potential reimbursements. One of the things, again, that my practice does is we focus on cost. So we have a lot of forensic accounting. So the T in SUSTAIN stands for track your costs. Track your costs now in the event you need to defend them later. Pretty simple context of understanding what our costs are, why do we have this additional cost, who authorized the cost. Documentation is key. So we have SUST in SUSTAIN. We go to A, which is accumulate documentation, as I just said. Get as much information and documentation as you can to defend your decisions later. And then I think this is very, very important. It kind of goes back to those key considerations I mentioned earlier. The plus COVID is, you know, okay, so our playing field has changed a little bit because of COVID. Is there anything that we can do to anticipate now, anything or any new mitigation techniques that we might be able to take now, something unique that came out of this COVID-19 impacted construction environment? And, you know, is there anything that we can do to keep our project on schedule, meet that schedule performance, or get it back on schedule as quickly as we can and as safely and efficiently, et cetera. And what we're seeing here with that, identify and mitigate, the I in sustain, and we're getting down to the last letter here in a minute, that we're using a lot of, the best companies are beginning to use data, collect data, subcontractor performance, employee performance, get as much data as you can, particularly on your subcontractors, and begin to look in predictive ways about what the next experience will be. I was on a webinar not long ago with the head of McKinsey's construction practice. And of course, everybody knows McKinsey is one of the top strategy consultants in the world, perhaps arguably the best. And the construction partner said, when somebody asked him a question, what's the single biggest thing that GCs need to deal with moving into the future? And he said, predictive project analytics. So the data that we begin to collect, and we probably ignored most of that kind of stuff because we're dealing with so many other stressors. That data can now be modeled, and it's relatively easy to do. We have some simple methodologies where we can predict performance. So we have to get through the project we have today. We're going to have a robust infrastructure breakout here soon, and when it happens, we have to be ready for all of that. And the best way to be ready for that, and one of the best ways to be ready, is to begin to think about it analytically and predictably as to what we can do. Now, the N in sustain, the very last letter of the 7-lettered methodology, is to the extent you need to, talk to your attorneys, talk to your insurance brokers, and make sure that if there are any notification requirements that you have to take care of, that you take care of on a timely basis, because oftentimes insurance contracts define that period of notification. If you do have a claim, or you think you might have a claim, or if your attorneys or brokers think you have a claim, make sure that you meet your notification requirements. So if you think sustain, and I'll be glad, I will shoot out to Giovanni a slide that has, we decided not to use slides today, but I'll shoot out a slide that really talks a little bit to the sustain methodology, that you can begin to think about it in that context. And of course, I mentioned liquidity. The liquidity is a big issue, and freeing up cash on the balance sheet is huge. It ties into that surety discussion. And I think I'm going to leave that discussion to Steve, who's an expert in that area, far more expert than I am, and let him take the baton from here.
So,
awesome.
Gary, I'm just going to jump in for a second, Steve. We're getting a number of questions, which is fantastic. If anyone wants to submit any questions, we have a Q&A module at the bottom. I've got a few questions to ask the panel, which is great. But right now, I'm going to turn my attention to Steve. I'm going to ask you a question, I guess, from the surety side of things. In our presentation to SCAFIA, we talked about the need for financial institutions and surety companies, bonding companies and whatnot, to backstop contractors and not pull the plug, cut the cord, if you will, too early, simply because a number of the contractors were shut down for a 6-week period. It was a government mandated shutdown. We received, no income during that time period, and because of that, we were basically carrying the project. I think what we're trying to do is avoid bankruptcies. We're trying to avoid undue bonding of items. And so I'm going to turn my attention now to that side of things. And if you could really, what could you see from the surety side of things? What do you see going forward?
Awesome. Well, I'd like to thank the group for having me today. And I think, from a surety perspective, I'm just going to reconfirm a lot of the things that my panelists have already said. But to kind of speak to the first part, I do believe the surety industry is ready to support our members on small to medium-sized contractors, as well as our large construction members moving forward. As well, construction is going to be looked at, and I think we all know this is to help stimulate the economy. I like to use statistics, and I think I did read one about a month ago that said, for every $1 million of investment into infrastructure by the federal or provincial governments turns into about $660,000 of real GDP. The surety industry, our industry, cannot turn a blind eye to that. Investment in construction is a proven driver. So with the Ontario government committing to sticking to its pre-pandemic pipeline of major P3 projects, and potential stimulus spending at municipal levels, but partnered with obviously the financial strain of the global economic pandemic that we're in, the surety industry and the construction industry are asking ourselves, how do we as contractors move forward and balance these potential needs for more credit support from providers like sureties while managing the balance sheet that is potentially at its most vulnerable position? Well, managing cash flow and liquidity coming out of COVID may be a challenge for contractors. And I know it's already been mentioned by my panelists, but don't be hesitant to be transparent and increase your communications and coordination with your creditors. It's only going to benefit you in the long run. You must think about, sureties and banks' needs will be and what key financial ratios you'll have to maintain to have access going forward. Is it fair to say that the surety marketplace has been soft for the last decade and support has been there for even some of our say maybe riskier construction credit? Probably. But and in speaking to member contractors, I know it's frustrated those contractors because they're seeing new entrants into the marketplace that they feel are unqualified to execute on contracts. What I can say now is post-COVID, there's being a far more due diligence being done by the surety industry. Not that they're not willing to support new entrants into the marketplace, but there's more questions being asked and a little more of a thorough, call it underwrite prior to just executing such bond. But everything that I'm saying, it's good information, but what do our sureties want to see going forward, or how do our contractors work in partnership with our sureties? Well, manage your firm's liquidity position has been far more highlighted now than say 8 months ago prior to the pandemic. And sureties are putting a heavier emphasis on ensuring that contractors look to manage their working capital more aggressively. Contractors can do that by ramping up collections, by educating project managers or creating internal controls for collections. Ways in which they can escalate matters before the receivable becomes a bad debt or uncollectible. I'm sure we have some GCs that are on this call right now that do a lot of self-performance. Have we considered supply chain issues? Have we been thoughtful about payment terms? Continuously reevaluating those payment terms and buying with longer terms where appropriate. Or even just something simple like considering our overheads and fixed costs. Understand, what is essential today now and what is an unnecessary expense. That could be a fine line between having a healthy year and having, a loss on the year. We all know financial metrics are the key drivers to a surety underwrite, but there's been such a heavier emphasis on our sureties wanting to understand, contractors' internal controls now. Sureties gain confidence in working with a client or even a prospect who's able to demonstrate that they have the correct internal controls to maintain the business. These internal controls could be, could be just financial reporting due diligence or sub-trade procurement practices. Those are just a couple of internal controls that instill confidence in your creditors. Working with your accountant, your broker, your surety to advise on how to properly instill proper internal financial reporting, such as a correct work on hand report, goes a very long way with your surety providers. The ability to demonstrate that the key decision makers or employees can review a financial snapshot of all ongoing backlog will allow a firm to simply or properly monitor and allocate resources to a struggling project and best efforts to sustain that anticipated margin. Sureties want to be able to review and have these conversations with key stakeholders on the health of all projects and point to specific jobs to better understand the strategies being implemented on said projects. For those contractors on the call who are looking to implement such reporting strategies but don't currently have them in place, use your broker. use your surety. They can help guide you. They can help you provide you with those work on hand reports, blank documents where they can guide and kind of take you in the right direction. But one of the other things we're seeing outside, say, the financial metrics or the things that I've spoken about is sureties are really focusing or the, you know, the word supply chain management. So sureties are really looking at who's affected by that. And it's all about sub-trade procurement. Sureties are now really asking those questions. Not that they haven't in the past, but they're really starting to understand, you know, has our contractors or have our partners, you know, is there change to our sub-trade procurement practices? Are we aware of any supply chain implications for hired sub-trades, and can they source the necessary materials for supplies? Our sureties just want to know that our clients are at least considering subcontractor default risk moving forward. I'm sure there's many contractors on this call, you know, who've had those tough conversations, or those that call them annoying conversations with their broker, their surety, about even bonding back a trade. It's becoming the reality. And we've seen GCs even make their own cognizant decisions to bond back a major sub-trade, or at least instill some form of sub-trade risk management strategy. And we're not even seeing it being asked of by the surety marketplace at this time. Now, I recently spoke to an underwriter, I believe last week, and one of their sub-trade clients was asked to post a bond on a development project. And it was not the ask of the surety, but it was the developer who was getting pressures from the lending community to bond back specific trades. So when we think about those types of things, we usually think it's dictated by sureties, but this is impacted throughout all creditors, and everybody's doing their own thorough due diligence or things that they should have been doing prior to 8 months ago. It's happening right now. And I know Geza kind of made a comment at the beginning about, you know, how I'm going to preach the good word of the surety or be that partner, but as a broker, as a surety broker, it's my job to kind of have a counterpoint, you know, kind of poke at it. And so I want to conclude with doing everything that I said is great. Please do not, like, it's great. But like other creditors, what if a surety changes course on you? You know, I've painted sureties as a helpful partner thus far, and they are. They really, really are. But we know that's not always the case. You know, communication and transparency speaks to how to disarm your surety or get your surety comfortable. But we need our members to be aware right now that our surety friends, they can quickly become our frenemies. I'm sure we have some sureties on this call that probably didn't like that comment, but they do know that it is the reality. And more importantly, now than ever, contractors and their brokers, they need to be intuitive and know what the post-COVID due diligence that I'm speaking to is different or is not, you know, a surety actually losing faith. And right now, those two can easily be misconstrued. And just it's up to contractors and brokers working in partnership to be ready to just navigate through that at this time.
So I think the main message that we're getting from our partners here, the presenters, the panelists, is that communication is key, and early communication is better than after the fact. If you have a question about a contract, get into it before you sign the contract, because once you sign it, there are repercussions there afterward. And if you're having issues, reach out to your surety provider and have that tough conversation, even though you run the risk of possibly having a frenemy as Stephen mentioned. So, gentlemen, it looks like Gary, again, the connection. He's back. Speak of the devil and he shall appear. So what I'd like to do is I have a number of questions that have been sent in. Some I've seen that Jason has been actively answering online, but I'd like to actually table it for the group so that they could go through it and speak to our audience on it. So first and foremost, I've got a question about, it was suggested that we add COVID-19 clauses to our contracts. Should we title the word, title and word these clauses specific to COVID-19, or should we utilize more general vague wording such as epidemic, pandemic, etc., in the event that references to the virus change and or others arise throughout the contractual relationship? So I'll put it out, panel, dive in.
Well,
I think Jason needs to unmute because I saw his lips moving, but dive in, please, Geza.
Well, let me start. I've just advised a client, a GC, on a contract, and we were very specific about COVID-19. The project was procured at a time prior to COVID-19. It had some generic language in it already. Wasn't good enough. Meanwhile, COVID-19 has happened, and the risks of COVID-19 are all quite well known. We're talking increased costs. We're talking the possibility of supply chain trouble. We're talking about the risk of a resurgence in the virus and of the possibility of a further shutdown. So we knew all the risks. And my recommendation to the client, which the client accepted, was, look, let's treat these in a very specific, head-on way, and we did. And the owner, God bless them, responded in kind, and we had a productive and useful interchange and concluded a deal. So I would recommend dealing with it head on. It's an obvious known risk. Cover it in the contract.
So Jason, what do you got to add on that one?
Yeah, I was just mentioning that I did answer it in writing, and not surprising, when you have two lawyers, you're going to get at least two different opinions, or at least a different nuance. I don't think that Geza and I ultimately disagree on the bottom line answer, although perhaps we'll see. But as I answered the question, I was leaning towards treating pandemics and epidemics as a category together on their own, so a more generic approach to your pandemic, epidemic. And the extent to which pandemics, epidemics differ from each other is the extent to which you'd want to consider a specific clause for COVID-19, enter your next pandemic or epidemic. But as I was responding to the question, to my mind, it seemed to me, not being a doctor or a specialist in epidemics, that there will be enough similarity amongst different kinds of pandemics, epidemics, that you might want to treat them as a single clause.
So I've got, still on the topic of force majeure and the COVID clauses, I'm going to change gears a little bit. I've seen contracts that have been submitted to the OGCA for review, and as I'm reading through it, it says that the contractor is responsible for pricing all COVID-related costs. My response back to the inquiry was that all known COVID-related costs can be covered if you know about what your PPE costs are, what your personnel costs are for the spacing and whatnot. But what if there's a government-mandated shutdown again, and we're shut down for 6 weeks? Does that mean that I'm supposed to carry some sort of buffer in my quote to anticipate such a shutdown? I'm going to throw it out to legal counsel as well. So what do you think?
Well, this was part of the risk that we canvassed in that contract that I talked about a minute ago. It was exactly that, and our message to the owner was, look, owner, you've got a choice. If you want us to, first of all, we the contractor can certainly price the risks that we are all aware of, that we know about. That's not a problem. Do that every day. If you want us to price risks that may materialize, such as a resurgence and the possibility of government shutdown, if you want us to assume that risk, we'll do it. But the price is going to be sky high, because what you're effectively buying from us is an insurance policy.
Yeah.
And we're going to charge. So that seemed to be persuasive. And the owner agreed to a rational risk allocation on the known risks, and then insofar as the unknown risks were concerned, we treated them as effectively a contingent risk into the future, and if they materialized, here's who pays what. And here's how that payment is to be made, and or the matter is to be compensated. And it's the only rational way to do it.
But again, I think it's important for the contractors to understand that you put that in writing, that the possibility of a contingent risk should be put in there simply, and not just assign something that says, oh, there's a clause that covers COVID. I think you really have to make the distinction. And I appreciate your candor on that one. And again, any of the contractors on the call that have any questions about them, you could have a specific case pursuant to your language in your contract. I recommend strongly that you seek legal advice and get it in writing to ensure that you're covered, because we don't want to be covering things, because again, we do price risk, we don't absorb it. Moving on, I've got another question that was tabled that I'm going to put out to the entire panel as a whole. What's the criteria of to calculate the productivity lost and how to track it through the project? I think this is very key.
I love this question, but I don't want to speak over Gary. Gary might want to give it a go first, but if he doesn't, I'll go at it first. I love the question. Actually, I should go first because I'm.
He's just like a lawyer. He talked himself into going first. Please, by all means.
I think he wants to challenge.
Go ahead, Jason.
It's the very intersection of science and black magic. It is the intersection of fact and myth. And the subject of much debate and dispute. And that's why I love this question, because there are methodologies that are employed by experts like Gary. I've seen a question from a friend of mine in the audience, Ali Fard, who's very sophisticated when it comes to these things too. And you need people like them, delay and quantification experts, to actually measure productivity loss on site. Why do I say it's the intersection of black magic and science? Because it is a science, for sure. Construction sites are incredibly complex beasts, and there are so many activities that are happening on site that cost money and time. Mapping those is the subject of, or subject matter of an expert. And experts can disagree, and there are different methodologies that can be employed to calculate the phenomena of delay and exactly what it costs. And what methodology to employ must be supported. And there are some circumstances where applying one methodology is more appropriate than another. And so that discussion amongst experts as they're trying to map productivity loss unfolds. So, you know, it becomes pretty easy to calculate that if you're building, you know, a deck in your backyard. When you're building a hospital, you're in the realm of what I'm talking about, which is a real challenge to nail down exactly, you know, how much have you lost in productivity as a result of impact of delay.
So Gary, you get now counterpoint, because I think Jason challenged.
Yeah, no, well, the challenge here is he's right. It's such a specialized area and such an important area that inside Marsh Advisory, we have a group that's called Workforce Strategies. And they're experts on workforce productivity, identifying, you know, what the appropriate, you know, bucket to put it in, how to differentiate that lost productivity. I mean, the easiest one to think about is, you know, the people that have to park further away. There's no place to park. How do you get there? The time to get there. There's different methodologies that people that focus on workforce strategies and what what was the workplace like, what was the productivity level, and now how has it been impacted. And I mentioned data and analytics and modeling. That's a big reason why there's such an explosive area of using the data, taking the numbers, putting them into the calculation, modeling it and simulating it, and then being able to predict it. In our case at Marsh, we do it in the context of insurance claims, and being able to have to defend that claim. And, you know, it's kind of a forensic exercise in some ways, but it doesn't have to be. It could be predictive. But Jason's right. There's nothing to challenge there. He said it very succinctly, right, spot on.
So you touched upon a point, and it ties into a question very, very nicely. With reference to predictive project analytics that you just tabled, Gary, first of all, is there sufficient technology out there to meaningfully predict future performance, and what tools can a contractor use, understanding that we have small, medium, and large contractors? So what do we got?
Yeah, our method, the methodology that I use on a couple of large projects, is one where we dive into about 100. It's very simple. It's going to sound a little bit more complicated than it is. We have 5 what we call key performance indicators: safety, project governance, ownership, who owns, things like that. That each one of those 5 key performance indicators is broken down into about 20 other sub KPIs, and then deeper to a total of 100. And it's a very simple methodology that's easy to deploy, where you just begin to kind of take a look at it like it's a scorecard or a grade card, and you take a look at your subcontractors that are on a schedule at any point in time. I mean, the idea of the PPA came from wanting to stave off even a single subcontractor default on a project. If you think about I think about now on some of the projects that I have, we have a shrinking resource pool, and you could have a project with as many as 5 or as many as 600 in some cases subcontractors on billion-dollar projects anyway. And what happens if at a critical moment on the schedule, because of resources impacted by the COVID, either people can't work, don't want to go to work anymore, or they get sick and they can't be replaced, or they're eaten up by a competitor. What impact is that going to have? So we take a look at the contractors and subcontractors that are on the schedule or getting ready to get onto the schedule, and we take a look. It's like a health check, and it's very, very simple. It can be done by a small or medium-sized company, particularly at the project level, and it can provide some transparency and some confidence, I think, to ownership of the company that, as we're beginning to deplete projects, our project backlog is being depleted faster than we can refill it. We have to make decisions on where are we going to make our investments and stuff like that. Predictive aspect of it allows us to at least take schedule uncertainty off of that plate, and allow ownership to begin in the company to begin to focus on other things and other adjustments that they need to be made. But it's not hard. It's not sophisticated. It doesn't require sophisticated computer modeling or anything. It's really a paper-driven exercise, and it can be as shallow or deep as you want it to be. But the idea is, for the predictive project analytics, is to begin to have an understanding of how the subcontractors at any point in time on a project perform, such you can say, okay, we used ABC subcontractor as our prime electrical sub on this project. We have 7 projects that we've been able to capture the data, and every one of them they scored in this particular way. It allows us to predict their ability to overcome some of these obstacles and stressors that we talked about earlier. So PPA it can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. I think for obvious reasons for the audience that we have, and for most of my clients, it's a very simple exercise that we work with them to get to some level of confidence on the project success.
So in regards to project risks and whatnot, we have another question. It's straightforward. Do you consider the preparation and agreement on a new baseline schedule to be a viable solution to reallocating / redistributing the project risk?
Yeah, I'm just typing an answer to that question, so I'll stop typing.
Okay.
I'll read you what I typed so far. Thanks for this question, Ollie, and happy to see you here. The answer is yes, but getting to that reallocation is quite the discussion for what I've seen in my practice. The contract is the guidepost from which parties can consider changes and how they want the changes in time and cost to be accounted for. And Geza and I are working on a number of contracts now where they're trying to make sense of the impact of COVID-19. And it's amazing to see the different perspectives from owner contractor sometimes as they approach an existing contract. Some say, well, the contract totally doesn't deal with us, so we need to renegotiate the whole thing. Sometimes you have to deal with that dynamic in play. And then others, there's a meaningful evaluation of the risks as they were sitting in the contract and trying to piece that together, and then everything in between. But certainly reallocating risk through the project schedule is definitely something that so many parties are grappling with. But you can't just throw out the existing contractual relationship as you struggle with that activity.
All right, so I've got, we're at the 1 o'clock mark. We're going to go a little bit overboard. I hope no one minds here, but I have a question specific to Stephen. You talked about ramping up collection, payment terms, and whatnot, and internal controls. Can you kind of walk us through how that fits into the whole Construction Act now? Because you've got certain payment requirements, and the money flow is going to be hopefully tighter, but work us through how a smaller, medium-sized, or large contractor, for that matter, can really focus on getting their controls to where a surety company will be confident in them.
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with just starting from the top and working down. And I find, or I've been seeing that, you know, or maybe I start with, you know, we have clients that, you know, ready to grow or ready to increase revenues, and then it doesn't end up coming with the expected margins or potentially reduced margins. And they ask the question, why is that? And you kind of peel back the onion and you ask yourself, what did we do wrong? And I think a lot of that has to do with what we've been talking about. It's a lot of internal communications. Having those internal softwares that can be utilized to implement certain strategies in regards to the payment terms that you talked to about the Construction Act. I think, you know, for our GCs, the ability to put in a proper invoice, I think that's the big thing. And I know that when the Construction Act came out, was what is a proper invoice? I thought I was always submitting a proper invoice. I think GCs are far more educated. I know I've seen Jason Geza speak on multiple panels on this at other symposium things is, you know, this is a proper invoice, submit that, and in theory, payment will come. But the problem is do we have, once again, that internal team to manage that? And I think in regards to my comment around margins or what we suspected margins to be, it's as the company ramps up or the Construction Act becomes far more sophisticated, do we have that internal team to manage that? And unfortunately, teams need to be more robust. Key decision makers and key colleagues can't have their hands on everything. So, you know, entrusting and putting those things into place will allow us to properly manage, have the appropriate software, the appropriate internal controls, you know, implementing the specific things in regards to getting payment processed or getting those invoices through to said municipality or to said provincial entity will help ramp that up. And then you know, so I've had a client that just says, then I got to become a bugger. Just stay on it. So I think that kind of dictates or allocates a little bit of kind of your question.
All right, so what I'd like to do now is just, I'm going to go around again alphabetically to all the panelists, and just any last words that you want to imbue upon our audience imparting to ensure that they really get the severity of the situation that we're in. Again, we knew going into pandemic that we're not going to have a Disney ending at the end of it, but again, I hope that after this discussion that we have communicated that there is hope out there. It's not bleak and whatnot. So let's start with Jason. What are your parting words for our attendees?
Be very mindful of the contracts that you enter and how risk is allocated, particularly in relation to force majeure, and don't start working until your contract is made.
Fantastic. Geza, can you enlighten us, please, with your beloved words of wisdom?
Probably not. I guess the only point I would make, and it reinforces the point made by others in this panel, is look, you've got lots of people out there who want to help you, and You know, the thing that I keep citing when I give talks on this theme of calling early rather than calling late, it's the old Fram oil filter commercial, which, you know, Gary and I at least are old enough to remember. I'm not sure about the rest of you, but it's the mechanic who's standing in front of his shop. Then behind him is a car up on the hoist, and the mechanic says to the camera, you know, you can call me now or you can call me later, as he's holding an expensive Fram filter. And that's really the message. It's take advantage of the expertise that's available to you. It's money well spent, and that includes not just lawyers, but also, you know, people like Gary, people like Stephen, or your own surety people. Call them early, get the advice, bounce things off of them, and maintain that kind of partner-like relationship with them, and that will pay dividends. That's what our best clients do.
Fantastic words of wisdom. So, Stephen, chime in. I'd like to hear from the surety side. What do you want our audience to leave with?
So similar to Geza, communication is key and transparency is key, but, you know, to parlay into something else, I think anyone can communicate, but you got to communicate the right things. And I think working on those internal controls, such as financial metrics or financial reporting, is going to be key. Being able to take financial snapshots of the business at any given time and properly, one, as a key stakeholder, understand what is going on within the business, but then also then sit in front of your creditors and navigate and effectively communicate those things is going to be huge. And I think, you know, without certainty, without saying with certainty, I think as long as, you know, there is success, there's good and valid communication in regards to the financial metrics, a surety will at least instill in confidence in you and continue to bond you know, those clients that they have through, you know, the present time and then what we foresee the future.
Fantastic. Gary, you get the last word.
Hey, thanks, Giovanni. You know, the takeaway, I mean, for me here is that more than anything, and I hear it from a lot of small and medium-sized general contractors, liquidity is such an important issue. You know, we can't lose track of the big picture, I think, here, what we have ahead of us, and watch liquidity slip away. You know, there are no real easy ways to deal with the liquidity issue. Some of it is tied to the surety aspect of it. But let's not lose track of the big picture and let liquidity slip away. Focus on liquidity. But I think the most important takeaway here is, and as Geza said, you know, or suggested, I've been around the block pretty much as long as anybody on this call, I think. And let's not treat this, I've seen this before, let's not treat this time as a problem so much as it is an opportunity. Let's go back to how we started this. Look at with optimism of what lies ahead. There's no doubt in my mind, I mean, some crazy things are happening on this side of the unbuilt border wall between Canada and the United States. But when things open up, I think infrastructure is going to boom, and it's going to create a lot of opportunities. And the folks that don't lose track of the big picture today and that position themselves for that are going to be the ones that are going to benefit, obviously, the most and still be standing. So there's a lot of optimism here. We're seeing it. There's a lot of interest in busting out infrastructure, both in Canada and the United States. And let's be ready for it. And let's use data-driven insights and things like that to help, you know, catalyze and drive us forward.
Gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for the presentation today. This, as the basis of the inaugural OGCA series, you've set the bar really high. And so we hope that we can deliver each one of our presentations in the same format and the same level of discussion and content that we've had here today. I want to, again, reiterate what the panelists have said in regards to, if you have any specific questions, you have resources, you're not without. You can reach out first and foremost to the OGCA if you just want a precursor to some guidance. And if you have more specific questions, we have a great affiliate or associate partner program. The individuals involved in that APP program are top-notch, as you can see by the panelists here today. They are here to assist. They are not here to hinder. And a dollar spent initially could translate into hundreds of millions of dollars at the back end. And that's what you would pay out as opposed to what you're going to receive, or vice versa. But do tap into the resources that we have. It's been a pleasure to moderate for such an auspicious panel. I want to thank you all once again very much. We will have this recording once we have it edited, posted up on our website. We will distribute to both Macmillan, to Marsh, and to anybody who would like it. And so with that, I want to thank you all. And any other questions, comments, or whatnot, just submit them directly to us, and we're happy for the input. All right. Thank you all, and we'll see you at the next seminar series.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you, everyone. Good day. Bye. Stay safe.